The Pharaoh's last stand, the 609 BC Battle of Megiddo. They said the Pharaoh would never fall. But on a dusty morning, in 609 BC, beneath the blazing sun of the Jezreel Valley, Egypt's pride met its destiny. The air trembled with the sound of thousands of chariot wheels. Bronze armor flashed like fire. In the distance, a small army waited, outnumbered, outmatched, but unbroken. At its head stood a young king named Josiah of Judah, facing the unstoppable might of Pharaoh Necho II. Most people never knew this truth. This was not Egypt's war. Necho was marching to aid Assyria, not to conquer Judah. But Josiah, defiant, faithful, or perhaps fated, chose to block his path. And in that single choice, two kingdoms collided, and history bent forever. What happened next would shock even the prophets. A single arrow, a single moment, would end an era and begin the road to exile, the last heartbeat of the kingdom of Judah. This was the Pharaoh's last stand. Before we uncover how courage, destiny, and tragedy met on the fields of Megiddo, subscribe, like, and comment your favorite ancient battle below, because you're about to witness history, the way it was never told. He rode that could not be ignored. The wind came first, dry, sharp, tasting faintly of iron. It carried a sound that no one mistook, the low thunder of hooves. Far on the southern horizon, the desert shimmered and breathed, and within that mirage, Egypt was moving. For the first time in a generation, Pharaoh Necho II had summoned the old fire of the Nile. Thousands answered. Charioteers polished bronze rims until they burned under the sun. Archers checked bowstrings made of sinew and faith. Drummers beat time into the bones of men who had forgotten what conquest smelled like. It was 609 BC. The Assyrian Empire, once the terror of the world, was dying. Babylon had crushed Nineveh, the jewel of the north, and now its armies marched westward, devouring cities like locusts. Pharaoh Necho saw the future clearly. If Babylon reached the Mediterranean, Egypt's lifeblood, its trade, its wealth, its power would wither. So, Egypt prepared to march not for glory, but for survival. Necho's plan was audacious. Join forces with the remnants of Assyria, hold the line at Haran, and stop Babylon before it swallowed the west. To reach Haran, however, Egypt needed the Great Trunk Road, the Via Maris, that wound through Qanon, through the Jezreel Valley, through That was the road no army could ignore. And fate had placed one man directly in its path. King Josiah of Judah, a reformer, a restorer, a man who had brought his kingdom back to the worship of one God. The scrolls say he tore down the idols, smashed the altars, rebuilt the temple. To his people, he was not just a king, he was a promise. But promises can be dangerous things. The first sign of Pharaoh's coming reached Jerusalem through dust and rumor. Traders spoke of endless columns of chariots, along the coast banners, of gold and crimson, the sun itself flashing from 1,000 shields. Josiah summoned his counselors. Some urged caution. The Pharaoh has said he does not come for Judah. Let him pass. Others whispered prophecy that the Lord had not sent this Egyptian army, and to allow it passage would invite ruin. No voice could drown out the pounding of Josiah's heart. He had rebuilt the covenant. He had purged the land of sin. How could he now bow before a foreign god's army? Still, doubt lingered like smoke in his mind. Necho's envoys came with words of peace. I come not against thee, O King of Judah, but against the house with which I make war. God commanded me to make haste. Forbear thee from meddling with God, who is with me, that he destroy thee not. But Josiah's silence was answer enough. In the valley of Jezreel, the landscape stretched wide and deceptive. Green plains kissed by morning fog, olive groves whispering to the hills. To the east, Mount Tabor stood like a silent sentinel. To the west, the ridge of Carmel clawed at the horizon. And in the center, Megiddo, ancient, watchful, scarred. Every empire that sought to rule this land had bled here. Thutmose III had marched here once 1,500 years earlier, and carved his victory into temple walls. He who holds Megiddo, he had written, holds the entrance to 1,000 cities. Pharaoh Necho remembered that, and so did Josiah. When Judah's scouts brought word that Egypt was approaching the valley, Josiah made his decision. He would intercept the Pharaoh at Megiddo, not with numbers, but with conviction. He believed his cause divine. He believed faith could defy empires. Most people never knew this. Judah's army was not vast. It was barely more than a strong city's garrison. Yet when the king rode out, the people followed, not because they expected victory, but because they could not imagine him standing alone. The sound of the army leaving Jerusalem was quiet. There was no fanfare, only the low hum of men preparing for something they did not fully understand. Women wept at doorways. Priests blessed the soldiers with trembling hands. The ark remained behind, but the spirit of defiance went with them. The march north took 3 days. Along the ridge roads, Josiah rode at the front, his cloak snapping in the wind. The closer they drew to Megiddo, the heavier the air became, as if the land itself remembered every scream it had swallowed. They reached the southern approaches at dawn. Mist rolled across the plain like breath from the earth. Josiah looked out and saw the walls of Megiddo, the city that had outlived kings, gods, and empires rising in the distance. A scout approached, face streaked with dust. "My king," he said, bowing low, "Egypt is near." Their chariots stretch beyond sight. The road trembles beneath them. Josiah's eyes narrowed. "Then this is the place," he said softly. "Here, between the mountains and the plain, the Lord will test the heart of kings." By midday, the sky had turned white with heat. The Egyptian vanguard appeared first, sleek chariots drawn by chestnut horses, banners whipping in the wind. The ground shook beneath their rhythm. Behind them came infantry columns, thousands, strong, shields of bronze gleaming like mirrors, spears angled toward heaven. The sound was not like thunder. It was heavier, slower, the heartbeat of a civilization moving as one. Josiah's men waited on the rise overlooking the narrow pass. The king stood among them, armor plain, face calm. "We fight not for land," he told them, "but for the right to stand unbowed." He looked toward the horizon, and for a moment perhaps only he could hear it, a whisper of prophecy in the wind. The first Egyptian scouts spotted the ambush. Horns blared. The vanguard halted. 1,000 arrows lifted, poised like iron birds. And then, silence. The kind of silence that comes before something irreversible. Josiah drew his sword. Loose. The valley erupted. Arrows hissed through the air. The first Egyptian chariots buckled under the sudden storm. Horses reared. Men fell screaming. Wheels shattered against the rocks. But Pharaoh's generals were veterans of countless wars. They reformed the line, ordered infantry to flank the hills. Judah's men fought desperately to hold the heights. Each heartbeat measured against the advance of giants. The battle became chaos, a swirl of dust, blood, and sunlight. Josiah rode through it, shouting orders, rallying his men, his voice cutting through the din like steel. Then, a shadow passed overhead, a hawk circling, slow and deliberate. Omens meant little to Necho, but his men watched the bird and murmured. Pharaoh raised his hand, signaling the chariot masters forward. "Break their ridge," he commanded. The order rolled like thunder down the line. Chariots surged, bronze wheels biting the soil. Arrows rained again. Judah's left flank faltered. Josiah turned to reinforce them, unaware that destiny was already drawing its bow. A cry rose, "The king! Protect the king!" But the arrow had already flown. It came from the Egyptian center, fired by a charioteer, whose name no scribe remembered. It struck deep beneath Josiah's arm. He gasped, staggered, and dropped his sword. The world tilted. His men caught him as he fell, eyes wide with disbelief. "Take me away," he whispered, "for I am sore wounded." They carried him from the field, his blood darkening the dust. Behind them, Judah's line wavered, the heart of their courage gone. Pharaoh's forces advanced, claiming the field, though Necho himself did not rejoice. He looked upon the valley, the dead, the silence, and muttered, "This was not the war I sought." Josiah died that day, and with him, something greater than a man. Judah's spirit cracked. The reforms ended. Within a generation, Babylon would come, iron fire, exile. As for Pharaoh Necho II, he continued north, to face Babylon's young prince, Nebuchadnezzar, had come. There, the Nile's empire would meet its end. But that is another story. For now, the valley of Megiddo lies still. Dust covers the bones. Wind whispers through the broken spears. And somewhere beneath the earth, the echo of Josiah's last breath still stirs the stones. Most people never knew this truth. The battle that ended Judah's last king also began the legend of Armageddon, the final battleground of prophecy. And perhaps, it was never just about Egypt or Judah at all. Perhaps, on that day, the world learned how every empire falls, not with a roar, but with a single arrow, and a silence that lasts forever. The king who would not step aside the night before. Megiddo was darker than most. No wind, no stars, just the quiet throb of men waiting for dawn. Somewhere among them, King Josiah walked alone. He had dismissed the gods, telling them he wished to pray. In truth, He was not praying, he was listening. Listening for the voice that had once guided him so clearly. The one that had led him to purge idols, to rebuild the covenant, to lift his people out of corruption. But that voice had been silent for days, and in its absence, doubt whispered louder. He looked toward the north, where the Egyptian fires burned faintly on the horizon, a necklace of orange embers. He knew Pharaoh Necho II was camped beyond the ridges, resting men and horses before the final push. Josiah's mind circled the same thought again and again. What if the Pharaoh truly speaks truth? What if God has sent him? But faith is rarely gentle with those who carry it. He knelt in the dirt, fingers digging into the earth. If I stand aside, he murmured, will Judah live, or will we die forgotten? No answer came, only the low moan of the valley wind, heavy and uncertain. When he arose, his decision was made. Whatever the cost, he would not let Egypt's gods walk Judah's soil unchallenged. At first light, the camp awoke to the crackle of torches and the clatter of armor. Horses stamped nervously, as squires tightened girths, and priests walked among the soldiers, whispering blessings. The smell of oil, leather, and fear hung in the air. Josiah emerged from his tent, armor plain but gleaming in the pale light. His captains bowed. Today, he said quietly, we do not fight for victory. We fight for meaning. The men nodded. They understood, some more than others. They moved out before sunrise, taking the narrow ridge paths toward the choke point south of Megiddo. The valley below shimmered gold with early light. Mist clung to the low ground like smoke. Every sound seemed louder, the creak of a cartwheel, the jingle of a bit, the sigh of leather against wood. From the opposite horizon, the Egyptian drums began. Slow, deep, relentless. Boom, boom. The sound crawled through the mist and into the bones of every man who heard it. Pharaoh Necho II stood atop a chariot of gilded bronze, his eyes calm, distant. Around him stretched the might of Egypt, rows of chariots gleaming like fire, standards fluttering, ranks upon ranks of soldiers painted with the dust of the desert. He was not a man easily moved by superstition, but even he felt a strange heaviness that morning, as if the gods of this land watched from the hills. A messenger approached, bowing deeply. Pharaoh, the Hebrew king, still blocks the pass. He refuses to yield. Necho's jaw tightened. Then he defies both me and the command of the heavens. I warned him. He turned to his general. Send another and tell him once more that I marched not against him. Perhaps reason will reach where pride has not. The envoy rode out under a white banner, vanishing into the haze. Hours passed before he returned. His head was bowed. The king of Judah will not hear you, my lord. Necho said nothing for a long time. Then, with a sigh that sounded like centuries, he murmured, then the road to Haran must be paid in sorrow. By midday, the valley trembled again. The Egyptian army began to move a slow, rolling surge of precision. Chariots led, infantry behind, banners high. The sun glared off bronze so fiercely that even the air seemed aflame. From his vantage on the ridge, Josiah watched the line approach, his face unreadable. Hold your ground, he ordered. Do not fire until they commit to the pass. The Egyptian column wound between the hills, disciplined and confident, until, without warning, the first volley screamed down. Arrows rained from the ridges, blackening the sky. The front ranks staggered. Horses reared. Dust exploded upward. Trumpets blared as the Egyptians formed shields overhead, the disciplined rhythm of veterans asserting control. But Josiah pressed his advantage. He sent the left flank down to harass the column, javelins flashing like lightning. For a moment, it worked. The Egyptians slowed, forced to fight uphill, losing their rhythm. Necho watched it all from his chariot. His general urged Pharaoh, allow me to flank them. No, said Necho. The valley itself will do the work. They have trapped themselves by courage. He was right. Judah's forces, though fierce, were stretched thin along the ridges. Their arrows began to dwindle. Egyptian archers advanced behind great leather shields, loosing volleys in reply. The sound was constant, a cruel rain, metallic and unending. Still Josiah rode among his men, shouting encouragement. Hold the line. The Lord fights with us. But the Lord, it seemed, was silent. Then came the twist of fate, the kind that reshapes history in a heartbeat. A dust storm, sudden and furious, swept down from the western ridge. Visibility vanished. Shouts turned to confusion. Judah's right flank mistook its own skirmishers for the enemy and loosed a deadly volley into friendly lines. Chaos spread like fire. Necho saw the opening. Now, he commanded. The Egyptian chariots surged forward, slicing through the haze, wheels cutting deep into the churned earth. The sound of their charge drowned even the wind. Josiah turned his horse, trying to rally the men. Stand fast. Do not break. But destiny had already found its mark. Through the storm, an Egyptian archer on a moving chariot drew his bow. He never saw the king clearly, only a silhouette against the light. He loosed. The arrow flew, spinning once, twice, and struck. Josiah gasped. For a heartbeat, he stayed upright, eyes wide in disbelief. Then he sagged forward, blood seeping between the plates of his armor. His officers rushed to him, panic in their voices. "The king is struck." They lifted him down, cradling him in the dust. His lips moved, forming words almost lost to the wind. "Take me from the battle, for I am sore wounded." He was carried toward the rear, each step marking the slow collapse of Judah's will. When the dust finally settled, the field belonged to Egypt. Necho's forces held their formation, silent except for the moan of the dying. The pharaoh stepped down from his chariot and looked upon the fallen king being borne away on a litter. A strange stillness overtook him. "He was brave," Necho murmured, "too brave for a small kingdom." He turned to his men. "Spare those who surrender. The road must run red, but not needlessly." There was no triumph in his voice, only fatigue. The ache of a man who had seen victory turn to ruin too many times. That night, the Egyptian fires burned across the valley, flickering on the blood-stained stones of Megiddo. The air smelled of metal and smoke. From the distance came the low wailing of Judah's survivors carrying their wounded king home. They brought Josiah back to Jerusalem. He did not live to see its gates. The city received him with mourning that shook its foundations. Women tore their garments, priests wept in the streets, and among them, the prophet Jeremiah wrote a lament, words so filled with grief that they were sung for generations. "How is the strong staff broken, the beautiful rod?" In that lament, Judah's future was already written: exile, fire, and silence. Pharaoh Necho marched north, still burdened by the shadow of the man he had slain. But he, too, was walking toward his fate. In a few short years, on the banks of the Euphrates, Babylon's young lion, Nebuchadnezzar, would crush him at Empires rise, empires fall, but the dust of Megiddo remembers them all. Most people never knew this. The name Megiddo in Hebrew would one day become Har Megiddon, a place where the final battle of the world would be fought. And perhaps it began here, with a single arrow, a single choice, and a king who refused to step aside. Because destiny, once challenged, does not forget. And as Pharaoh Necho's army vanished into the northern haze, the valley behind him whispered a prophecy, one that still echoes through time. No empire leaves Megiddo unchanged. The story continues. Under the walls of Megiddo the morning after, Megiddo was the kind of quiet that doesn't heal, the kind that listens. Smoke curled lazily over the battlefield, twisting in the pale light like spirits rising. The grass, once green and proud, was crushed beneath the weight of armor and blood. The crows had come early, black wings slicing through the dawn. Pharaoh Necho II stood among the ruins of victory. His chariot was still, his armor dulled by dust. He had won. Yes, the road to Haran was open, but his heart was heavy with the sound of silence. Around him, the Egyptian camp moved in somber rhythm. Soldiers gathered weapons, tended to the wounded, spoke little. Even triumph had turned hollow. Necho's scribe approached, bowing low. "Great Pharaoh, Judah's king is dead." The pharaoh's gaze remained on the horizon, where the hills of Megiddo curved like the spine of an old beast. "He was brave," he said softly. "Too brave for the god's design." The scribe waited, uncertain. "Shall we record this as victory, my lord?" Necho's eyes narrowed. "Victory." He turned slowly, voice low but sharp. "When the young fall for the pride of kings, there are no victors. Write this instead: a road cleared by sorrow." On the opposite slope, the survivors of Judah moved like ghosts. They had carried Josiah's body through the night, a silent procession of broken men. His armor, once shining, was stained the color of rust. His face was calm, almost serene, as if death had found him mid-prayer. Captain Hilkiah, his loyal commander, rode at the head of the escort. He had not spoken since the arrow struck. His men followed, hollow-eyed, the valley, echoing with the creak of wagons and the slow beat of lamentation drums. At the foot of Megiddo's wall, a group of women came out, Canaanite traders who had watched the battle from afar. They knelt, placing water jars before the dead. In their eyes was neither allegiance nor malice, only recognition. They had seen this pattern before. Conquerors come, conquerors go, and the valley remains. One of them whispered, "Another king falls to Megiddo." The wind seemed to answer. As the Judahite column passed beyond sight, Necho mounted his chariot again. The sun was rising, harsh and white. His generals awaited orders. Shall we pursue them, my pharaoh? Asked one. Their morale is broken. Necho shook his head. No, they have lost what I never sought. Let them bury their king. We marched north. He pointed toward the distant hills, where the road climbed toward Galilee and beyond to the plains of Syria. The Assyrian remnants await us. Babylon moves fast, too fast. Every hour lost here weakens the line at Haran. His tone hardened. Break camp. The dead will teach the living what haste cannot. The army obeyed. By noon, Egypt's columns had begun to move again, but as the last chariot turned from the valley, Necho looked back one final time. From where he stood, Megiddo seemed ancient beyond reckoning, its walls sun-scorched, its gates dark with memory. He thought of Thutmose III, who had conquered the same ground 1,000 years earlier. How many kings had Megiddo buried since then, he wondered. How many dreams had this soil devoured? He whispered to the land, though no one heard, "Do not remember me among the proud. Remember me among those who carried the burden." Then he rode north. In Jerusalem, news of Josiah's death arrived like a thunderclap. The city wailed. The sound rolled through every street, from the temple courts to the market alleys. Women tore their garments, priests fell to their knees, and men stood staring at the ground, as if the world had tilted. The prophet Jeremiah, eyes red from sleeplessness, walked through the crowd. He stopped at the palace steps, his voice breaking as he began to speak. "Lament, O daughter of Zion," he cried, "for the shepherd has fallen. The lamp of the righteous is quenched." The people answered him with weeping. Even the children were silent. They buried Josiah with honor, the last king of Judah who had walked in faith. Over his tomb, the priests burned incense and sang the songs of David. But beneath the melody was a tremor. The knowledge that something had ended. A kingdom could survive defeat. It could even survive occupation. But losing a righteous heart, that was the beginning of exile. Far away, the Pharaoh's march continued through the lands of Galilee. The heat shimmered across the hills, turning men into shadows. Scouts rode ahead, returning with grim news. Babylon's forces were already moving west, led by a young prince named Nebuchadnezzar, the heir to an empire of flame. "He's clever," Necho muttered when he heard the name. Too clever for his years. He knew the meeting at Carchemish would decide more than territory. It would decide the master of the ancient world. Yet even as he planned his next campaign, Josiah's face haunted him. He had seen the young king's body carried from the field, and something in that image had carved itself into his soul. The memory followed him like a ghost riding beside his chariot. "Why did he stand in my path?" Necho asked aloud one night, as the army camped near the waters of the Jordan. His general answered carefully, "Perhaps, my lord, he believed the gods spoke only to him." The pharaoh looked into the fire. "Then the gods are cruel to those they love." Back in Judah, the throne stood empty for only a heartbeat before chaos returned. Josiah's son Jehoash was crowned quickly, chosen by the people, young, impulsive, passionate, like his father. But when news of this reached Necho, he was unmoved. "This boy is not his father," he said coldly. "He will not lead Judah to wisdom." As the pharaoh's army returned southward from its northern campaign, he summoned Jehoash to Rip, and there, under the weight of Egyptian power, the young king was stripped of his crown. Judah became a vassal once more, its freedom traded for survival. And though Necho believed this act would secure peace, it only planted the seeds of rebellion, the kind that never dies quietly. That winter, the pharaoh's banners reached the Euphrates. The air there was colder, the wind carrying the scent of war yet to come. Ahead lay the ruins of Haran, and beyond it, the armies of Babylon, young and hungry. As Necho surveyed the horizon, he spoke to his scribe again. "Write this, for the generations after me. The world is turning, and Egypt stands at its edge." The scribe hesitated. "What of Megiddo, my lord?" Necho's expression hardened. Megiddo was not victory. It was warning. He looked up at the vast northern sky. "Tell them every road to power is built on the bones of kings." Meanwhile, in the valleys behind him, the grass grew again over the blood. The vultures left. The silence returned, and only the stones remembered. Travelers passing through would whisper of strange echoes near the old walls, whispers that sounded like voices carried on the wind. They said if you listened long enough, you could still hear Josiah's last words. A prayer swallowed by dust. Most people never knew this detail. But archaeologists centuries later would find arrowheads buried deep in Megiddo's soil. Bronze and iron fused together by ancient fire, proof that this place had tasted both courage and ruin more than once. And so, under the walls of Megiddo, two destinies crossed, one king falling, one king marching on, both doomed by forces larger than themselves. The pharaoh rode north into the jaws of Babylon. Judah sank into mourning and silence. The valley stayed still, patient as eternity. But history was already moving again, gathering speed toward a new storm. For somewhere beyond the Euphrates, the young prince of Babylon was waiting, a commander who would burn his name into the heavens. And when these two men met, the last light of Egypt would flicker out. But that is another reckoning. The arrow, the standard, and the turning of the WROD, the road to Carchemish was paved with ghosts. For weeks, Pharaoh Necho's army marched through broken lands, past villages abandoned to silence, rivers that carried the ashes of fallen cities, and plains where even the wind seemed afraid to speak the names of gods. The old world was ending, and he could feel it. Every night, the fires of his camp flickered low against the horizon, and the men whispered of Babylon, of a young general who fought like a storm, who turned fear itself into a weapon. They said his name softly, as if to speak it too loudly might summon him. Nebuchadnezzar. Necho had never seen him, but he had read enough of the omens to know the truth. This was not just another enemy. This was the beginning of something new. He remembered what the priests of Heliopolis had told him before his march. The Nile flows backward when the sun prepares to set. The crown that follows yours will be of fire. And now, marching north under gray skies, the pharaoh began to wonder if the gods had already chosen the side of tomorrow. By the time his army reached the banks of the Euphrates, the land had turned from dust to river mist. The air here was different, wet, heavy, ancient. Across the water, the ruins of Haran still smoked, the last breath of the Assyrian Empire rising into nothing. Assyria was gone. The ally Necho had come to save no longer existed. Most of his generals urged retreat. Let us return, my pharaoh. The north belongs to Babylon now. But Necho, weary yet proud, shook his head. We did not march this far to be remembered as shadows. We hold the river. We hold the line. That night, as his camp settled under the cold light of the moon, he stood by the water's edge, staring across to the opposite bank, where Babylonian fires burned like stars fallen to earth. He could see their standards, the Lion of Marduk rippling crimson in the wind, and hear faint drums echoing from across the current dot. Between them lay the Euphrates, wide, deep, ancient, the river that divided not only two armies, but to ages of mankind. In Babylon's camp, Prince Nebuchadnezzar watched the Egyptian torches through narrowed eyes. He was young, barely 30, but there was nothing untested about him. He had fought since his youth, learning the language of command from the chaos of the front. He knew the rhythm of fear, the pattern of courage. His men called him the Hawk of the East. He turned to his advisor. He is old, Nebuchadnezzar said. He carries the weight of centuries on his shoulders. That makes him dangerous. Dangerous, yes, said the advisor, but also slow. The pharaoh fights to hold the past. We fight to seize the future. The prince smiled faintly. Then we will see whose gods wake first. At dawn, the sky over Carchemish turned the color of ash. Mist clung to the river, veiling the opposite shore. Necho's army lined the bank, thousands of shields catching the first pale light. Drums began to roll, low, deliberate. Across the water, Babylon's war horns answered, deep and thunderous. Both armies waited for the signal. Both generals stared across the river, knowing that one sunrise later, only one empire would remain. Then, with a cry that tore the morning apart, the first Egyptian arrows soared across the Euphrates. The Battle of Carchemish had begun. The sound was overwhelming. Drums, horns, the hiss of arrows cutting through fog. The river churned with the bodies of men and horses. Egyptian chariots thundered down the embankments, splashing into the shallows, their wheels spinning in the mud. But Babylon was ready. Nebuchadnezzar had ordered hidden crossings upstream during the night. By the time Necho realized what was happening, the Babylonians were already flanking his position. The pharaoh cursed under his breath. Clever boy. He raised his staff, a serpent of gold coiled around obsidian, and signaled the camp. The Egyptian archers formed ranks, loosing volley after volley. The sky darkened with arrows. The first Babylonian line faltered. For a moment, it seemed the old lion still had claws. But then came the roar. From the eastern plain, Babylon's war chariots, newly built, heavier, faster, charged into the fray. Their wheels were iron-shod, their horses massive. They struck like thunder, tearing through Egypt's flanks. The pharaoh's men fought bravely, but the river had betrayed them. The mud turned footing into chaos. Soldiers slipped, drowned, or were trampled under their own. Necho stood firm, shouting orders, his voice rising above the chaos. Hold the standard, "The Nile stands with us." But the Nile was far away, and the Euphrates did not care for foreign kings. By midday, the fog had lifted, revealing ruin. Egypt's lines had fractured. The field was a blur of broken chariots, fallen banners, and bodies half buried in silt. Necho's personal guard formed a circle around him as Babylonian arrows rained down. One struck his chariot driver in the throat. Another shattered the crest of his crown. The pharaoh's face was streaked with dust and blood. He looked up, eyes fierce. "So this is how the gods choose," he muttered. Then, through the smoke, he saw it. The standard of Babylon, the lion banner advancing through the haze. Beneath it rode Nebuchadnezzar, young, calm, and merciless. Their eyes met across the distance. The last pharaoh of Egypt, and the first true king of Babylon. A single heartbeat where the past and future recognized one another. Then came the charge. Babylonians swept through what remained of Egypt's vanguard. The ground shook with the weight of it. The pharaoh's chariot overturned, wheels splintering. His guards pulled him free, shouting, fall back to the river." But Necho refused. He planted his staff in the mud, raising the falcon standard of Ra one last time. "Egypt does not run," he said, "not while I draw breath." His men rallied around him, desperate, bloodied, loyal beyond reason. For a brief moment, the old world stood unbroken. And then the arrow came. It was black-fletched, iron-tipped, loosed from the bow of a Babylonian captain who never knew whose heart it would find. It struck the pharaoh's arm, piercing through flesh and silk. He staggered, gripping the shaft, eyes blazing with defiance. "I have seen this before," he gasped, remembering Megiddo, remembering another arrow. Another king. History was repeating itself, but this time, it was the pharaoh's blood that fed the soil. By sunset, the battle was over. Egypt's army was shattered. The survivors fled south, leaving behind wagons, weapons, and the bones of their empire. The Euphrates ran dark with silt and blood. Nebuchadnezzar stood on the riverbank, his armor dented, his eyes reflecting the dying light. Around him, his generals bowed. "The river is ours," one said. The prince looked toward the west, where the sun sank into Egypt's direction, its light fading. "No," he said quietly, "the world is ours." Behind him, the banner of Babylon rose, the lion of Marduk, crimson against the dying sky, while the falcon of Egypt lay trampled in the mud. The age of the pharaohs had ended. The age of Babylon had begun. That night, in the wreckage of the battlefield, the wounded pharaoh sat beside the river. His healers tended to him, but he waved them away. He watched the water flow, calm and endless. One of his priests knelt beside him. "My lord, we must return to Egypt. You will die if you stay." Necho smiled faintly. "I will die whether I stay or go. But listen, do you hear it?" The priest frowned. "Hear what, my pharaoh?" "The river," said Necho. "It sings for Babylon now." He looked eastward, where the first stars began to pierce the sky. "Tell the scribes to record this night, not as defeat," he whispered, "but as the turning of the world." Then he closed his eyes, and the old empire wept for him in silence. Most people never knew this detail, that the same pharaoh who watched King Josiah fall at Megiddo would himself fall to Babylon's rise at Carchemish. To arrows, 2 kings, 2 worlds ending. The dust of Megiddo and the mud of the Euphrates became the bookends of an age. And from that moment on, every empire that rose would carry within it the shadow of those arrows. Reminders that power bends to time, and even gods cannot stop the river from changing its course. The falcon had fallen, the lion had risen. But in the valleys of Judea, a whisper remained, the prophecy of a people who would one day return, carrying memory as their only weapon. And beyond the horizon, destiny stirred again. Because what began at Megiddo was not the end, it was the beginning of every ending yet to come. Aftershocks, from Megiddo to Carchemish and Bayanditha. Winds that carried the smoke of Carchemish did not stop at the Euphrates. They traveled west over broken bridges, burned-out villages, and the long, empty roads of empire. They carried whispers. The pharaoh is fallen. Babylon has risen. In every marketplace from Tyre to Thebes, the story changed shape. Sometimes Pharaoh Necho was dead, sometimes captured, sometimes fled. But the truth, like the river, flowed steadily beneath rumor. The world had turned. The old gods were silent now. In the city of Jerusalem, the mourning bells had barely stopped from Josiah's death when new ones began to toll. Pharaoh Necho, though wounded and weakened, had installed Jehoiachin, Josiah's elder son, upon Judah's throne. The young king bent his knee to Egypt. Gold and tribute flowed south, but it was a fragile peace. The people still whispered Josiah's name in their prayers. They still looked eastward at night, where Babylon's fires glowed faintly beyond the horizon. Jeremiah walked among them, his robe torn, his voice hoarse from warning. "The north wind rises," he said, "and with it, the lion from Babylon. Judah will drink from the same cup it offered others." No one wanted to believe him, but the wind that carried the dust of Megiddo was already returning far to the north. On the banks of the Euphrates, Nebuchadnezzar stood before the remnants of his victory. He was king now. His father Nabopolassar had died, and the crown of Babylon rested upon his head. He looked across the fields where the bodies of Egyptians lay, thousands of them, darkening beneath the sun. The vultures circled in slow, deliberate spirals. The river murmured softly, as if whispering an elegy. Nebuchadnezzar did not smile. He was not made for triumph. He was made for endurance. A messenger approached and bowed. "My king, the Pharaoh's forces have retreated to Ham. Egypt bleeds. The west is open." Nebuchadnezzar's eyes narrowed. "Then the west will learn our name." He turned to his generals. "March. Let no wall stand that remembers Assyria or Egypt. The world belongs to Babylon now." The campaign that followed was swift and merciless. Babylon's armies stormed city after city, their siege towers rising like iron mountains. Ashkelon burned. Damascus surrendered. The coast of the Levant became a chain of smoking ruins. Only Judah remained untouched, small, faithful, trembling between two giants. Jehoiakim hesitated. To serve Egypt now was to defy the new master of the earth. He changed allegiance, offering tribute to Babylon. For a time, the lion spared him. But kings who serve two masters never sleep long. Back in Egypt, Pharaoh Necho II recovered slowly. His arm, scarred from the wound at Carchemish, never fully healed. He would sit in the gardens of Sais beneath the shade of palms, watching the Nile's slow current, remembering the sound of the Euphrates, remembering the boy prince, who had looked him in the eye as one age ended and another began. He no longer wore his crown for comfort. It felt heavier now, as if each jewel was a sin he could not undo. He thought often of Josiah, of that arrow at Megiddo, of the words that had haunted him ever since. "Stand aside, for this battle is not yours." Now, in the quiet of his palace, he finally understood. The message had not been a threat. It had been mercy. The gods had not sent him to fight. They had sent him to witness the end of his kind. Years passed. Egypt shrank back behind its deserts. Babylon rose like a burning sun. Its king, Nebuchadnezzar, became the shadow of the world. His armies vast, his engineers unmatched, his cruelty legendary. In 597 BC, Judah rebelled again. Nebuchadnezzar returned, swift, brutal, unstoppable. He took the city, carried off its nobles and treasures, and set Jehoiachin, Josiah's grandson, in chains. But even that was not enough. A decade later, Jerusalem rebelled once more. This time, the lion did not spare the lamb. 586 BC, the Babylonians breached Jerusalem's walls. The temple burned. The ark was gone. The streets ran red with ash and lamentation. Jeremiah stood amid the ruins, his eyes hollow. He looked toward the north, where smoke merged with the clouds, and whispered, "It began at Megiddo." The arrow that struck Josiah had pierced more than a king. It had pierced time itself. For when Josiah fell, Judah lost its shepherd, and without a shepherd, a kingdom walks blindly into exile. Meanwhile, in the halls of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar commissioned walls, so tall they cast shadows at noon. He built temples for Ishtar, palaces for himself, and the hanging gardens for a queen who missed the green hills of home. But even he, the most powerful man of his age, would one day walk out upon his balcony and feel a strange emptiness. Power could conquer land, but not silence the memory of those who had stood before him. He could crush Egypt, but he could not erase Megiddo, because Megiddo was more than a place. It was the sound of the old world breaking. Centuries would pass, empires would rise and fall, Persia, Greece, Rome. Yet the valley of Megiddo remained, silent and waiting. Its stones still carried the whisper of chariot wheels. Its soil still hid the bronze arrowheads of two kings. And men began to tell stories. Stories that grew with every generation. They said the earth there remembers blood. They said the end of the world would come where the first civilizations had fallen. They called it Megiddo, Armageddon. Most people never knew this detail. But in the scrolls of ancient prophets, Megiddo was named as the place where the final war between good and evil would unfold. The last stand of mankind, beneath a sun turned black. Whether prophecy or memory, no one could say. But every empire that rose afterward walked the same path. Proud, glorious, and doomed to repeat the same march toward Megiddo's shadow. Because that is what the valley teaches. No throne stands forever, no banner outlives the wind, and every empire, no matter how divine it believes itself to be, eventually meets its reflection, a younger power with sharper teeth. In the end, the pharaoh's name faded from the stone walls of Egypt, the inscriptions weathered, the paint flaked, the Nile carried his story back to the sea. But somewhere, beneath the layers of time, the echo remains, the moment when one king rode to block a road, and another marched to defend a dying age. 2 arrows, 2 destinies, 1 lesson carved into eternity. Every age ends the same way, in a battle it cannot afford, fought by men who believe they can change the tide. The wind still moves through the valley of Jezreel, brushing across the silent ruins of Megiddo. Tourists stand there now, cameras clicking, unaware that beneath their feet lies the grave of King Josiah. But if you close your eyes, if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the rumble of chariot wheels, the clash of bronze, and the final breath of the pharaoh's last stand. And somewhere, deep in the dust, a voice still whispers, "Remember Megiddo, for every empire must face its own." And so ends the story of the pharaoh's last stand. The Battle of Megiddo, 609 BC, where faith challenged fate, courage met consequence, and the world turned beneath the weight of 2 dying kings. Empires fell, legends were born, and history was never the same again.